Johnson and say thank you very much for coming.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're fiddling with the sound and stuff at the moment, so I might be twiddling some of these knobs here. Yeah. Yeah, well that's my computer, so I need that one on. So I'll put that on. So they're still fiddling with the sound and stuff. I'll turn the other one off. There's a bit of buzzing, but that's alright. I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and for coming such a long distance. If you have come a long distance, and if you've come a short distance, thank you for coming. As Andy said, there's stuff out there. I've got various sort of booklets and discs and so on. 50p a booklet, 50p a disc. You're probably, some of you here were here in October when I came with Dr. Judy Wood, and we've now got books. I've got 5 books here tonight. So if you want one of the books, if you're interested in getting one that time, the hardback books are £25. I've got 2 or 3 of my paperbacks there, £8. So if you want to get those, I think somebody's handling the money. There's a little box of money there which I've left out trustingly. So I'm hoping there's more in that when I go away than when I came. And if there is, I'll be happy. And I think that, and then the other thing, I'm still sort of researching into the 9/11 stuff. This is a new talk I've put together tonight. I actually prepared it for next week for the New Horizons group. But then Andy asked me to do it for this week, so that's fine, because I had it already. It's a bit of a departure from some of the other stuff, but hopefully you'll find it interesting and enlightening in certain respects. The 9/11 stuff, I'm still doing stuff on that, and we've got some new information coming out probably next weekend from Richard Byrd. So if you keep an eye on his website, you're going to see some new information which is going to upset quite a few people, I think, judging by the sorts of rumblings that have been happening. So keep your eye out for that if you're interested in finding out a bit more about 9/11. Okay, so I'll try and soldier on with this, and we'll see where we get to. What I'm going to try and do tonight is I'm going to look at basically 2 parts of this story, as it were. We're going to look at the evidence which leads some to think that the Earth could be hollow. This is a thing that's gone around, you know, in legends and myths for a long time. I was perfectly open-minded to this story. It sounds ridiculous to some people, you know, mainstream science just said, oh, it's just rubbish, you know. But I wanted to look into it, and I have looked into it, and you'll see what I came up with. And we're also going to look at the evidence that the Earth is actually expanding in size. It's been growing in size for, well, basically since it was formed. Now, I only came across this idea in 2006, and I found it quite interesting, and you might think, oh, that's a bit weird. But again, when we go through this, you'll see there's actually a heck of a lot more research out there than, you know, than I became aware of, and I'll go through some of that. But as usual with all this sort of stuff, there's some really good information, and there's some pretty awfully bad information as well, particularly with the hollow Earth stuff. There's a real mix of stuff. So I tried to sort of sort through this, and you know, I've never been to the hollow Earth. You know, I've never spoken to anyone that claims to have been there, but I have read one of the key stories and studied it in some detail, and that's one of the main bits that I'll be going through. I'm going to start off with an impressive video clip. This kind of kicked me off into doing this presentation. Somebody sent me, and I'll show you that in a minute. And it's just really quite a nice video that kind of fired my imagination somewhat, I suppose. And we're going to look at the history of hollow Earth thinking and ideas a little bit, how that came to be. And then we're mainly going to look at the tale of Olaf Jansen, who's a Swedish man who claimed to have visited the inner Earth with his father in 1830, and this is one of the most sort of lucid accounts that you come across. And I tried to study this in some detail. In fact, you can find the story of that. I'll talk about this later, and I've got a booklet of it out there as well. It's such a wonderful story, whether it's true or whether it's not. I made it into a booklet, and I printed a few copies out. We'll look at some of these apparent pictures of holes at the North Pole. which is one of the common things you come across. Oh, there's holes at the North Pole and stuff. Well, we'll go into that. We'll look at Admiral Byrd's trips to the poles and Operation Highjump, and this is one of the things that you tend to come across if you start researching into this. One of the first names you'll come across is Admiral Byrd and Operation Highjump. If you Google Hollow Earth, that's about, and Google it, that's one of the first things that will come up. We're going to look at a clip from Michael Palin's trip to the South Pole. He went there on the BBC series Pole to Pole in 1991. So there's a little interesting clip from that, which gives us perhaps an interesting clue to one or two things. Ideas about seismology, in other words earthquakes and aurorae, which some people claim says there's a hollow earth. I've looked into that. And the North Pole Inner Earth expedition, which is supposedly going to happen this summer. And the second half, I'll see how time goes. Again, I usually look at my watch to see how time goes. I roughly time this to 2 hours, but depending on how things go, I might skip over certain things, so we'll see how we go on. But in the second half, what I intend to do, first half is hollow Earth, second half is going to be the expanding Earth. And we're going to look at the short history of things like continental drift and plate tectonics, which some of you remember from your geography lessons and stuff, and I remember from my geography lessons. And we'll look at a short video by Neal Adams about the expanding Earth. You'll come across his name if you Google expanding Earth. He'll come up pretty quickly. And we're going to look at a bit about Professor S. Warren Carey of the University of Tasmania, who I only came across this year when I started research into this. Very interested. And the comprehensive research of a chap called James Maxlow, PhD. He's a PhD geologist, and amazingly enough, he did his PhD research and he got his PhD study, awarded for the expanding Earth, all about the expanding Earth. And I've got a print out part of his website out there in a booklet as well. And then we're going to look at Stephen Hurrell's mention his book, which I've just read, called Dinosaurs and the Expanding Earth, which is again a very interesting angle on this. And he suggests that the force of gravity was much reduced 150 million years ago. So that's it is quite interesting. So I'll now just sort of put up a couple of these images, and to start off, you've probably seen the films, Journey to the Centre of the Earth. This is the remake. I didn't even know they'd remade this, but this is Brendan Fraser and this wonderful lurid artwork. And then, of course, from the 50s, Journey to the Centre of the Earth and so on. You get all these stories. And then, Edgar Rice Burroughs at the Earth's core, and I heard Richard Hoagland on Coast to Coast recently talking about Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter story, John Carter on Mars, and Hoagland was going on that Edgar Rice Burroughs knew something, but I don't know, I wasn't convinced by that at that point. And then you have this, I think 1997, at the core rather, where they go down to the Earth's core and stuff. So these are just sort of Hollywood sort of versions of this, and there's not really much for me to say about those other than that they're just stories really. They don't really have any basis in any particular science really. I think some of elements of that might have been pulled from Olaf Jansen's story, but that's about all I would say on that. So what I want to jump to now then, if this works all right, should do, is this wonderful video clip. I think it's about 3 minutes long. You might find some of the captions are a bit small, but it's just quite a sort of trancy video, which I quite like, so I'm hoping that this will play. I might have to fiddle with the sound. Oh, you're going to play? Oh, heck. Let's just try this again. Oh, heck. It doesn't look like it's going to play on here, which will be annoying. It won't really be vital. I'll just have a quick fiddle and see if I can get that to play, because it's not coming in the right format. So let me just get this. It's not vital, but it's quite nice if I can get this to play. software, and it just take a few seconds. Yeah, there we go. I can turn the sound up on that now. Got it going eventually. Trying to eject it. So as you can see, that really illustrates the main sort of features of the Hollow Earth story. I'll just set this back into the PowerPoint now. That essentially illustrates the main features of the Hollow Earth in this idea that you've got this central sun, you have a hole at the North Pole, a hole at the South Pole. You get this effect of anomalous seismic signatures. You have that sort of shadow thing that showed up briefly. So that kind of put together a number of these stories that you hear, and it seemed to sort of suggest that it was true. So those are the things that I started to look into, and that was produced by somebody called Neal Lighting that you saw at the end there. It was a lovely piece of video. A lot of time must have gone into producing it with all those overlays, and you saw the different layers flying out, and the spinning captions and all this, done with Cinema 4D, if you know this software, Adobe Premiere and so on. A lot of time went into that. Now, if you go and look at the various sort of stories, the history of the Hollow Earth is quite long. In ancient times you had the idea of the subterranean realms, and it seemed arguable became intertwined with the concept of places such as the Greek Hades, the Nordic Svartalfheim, the Christian Hell, of course. People sort of said, so this might be inside the earth, and the Jewish Sheol, with details describing inner earth in the Kabbalistic literature, such as the Zohar and the Hesed of Aram. And Sir John Leslie wrote on page 450 of his 1829 book, Elements of Natural Philosophy, second edition, the idea which I formerly threw out in the article on meteorology of the supplement to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, that the ocean may rest on a subaqueous bed of compressed air, is therefore not devoid of probability. In other words, he was suggesting, even in 1829, that there may be compressed air under the seabed, which essentially is a form of Hollow Earth. So, you know, this wasn't sort of totally ridiculed until quite recently. And he included some calculations which suggested that the Earth may not just be solid matter. He did try and calculate it because he was looking at natural philosophy. And that's in Google. You can get that in Google Blocks, that book, the one that I referred to there, The Elements of Natural Philosophy. And then in 1692, Edmund Halley, or Edmund Hawley as some pronounce it, put forth the idea that the Earth consists of a shell about 800 kilometres thick, and two of the inner concentric shells and an innermost core with about the same diameter of the planet Mars. Halley did have scientific grounds for his rather bizarre thought construct. It tried to explain why compass readings were so anomalous. Each of the inner spheres had their own magnetic poles and rotated at differing speeds. And to compound his error, Halley proposed that the inner spheres might be inhabited and that the inner atmosphere was made up of luminous gases when escaping outward, causing the aurora borealis. So people were looking at things and trying to explain them, even in those times. And so, obviously, Halley was a mathematician, and so you wouldn't expect him to come up with this idea of a hollow Earth, but indeed he did. He did speak about it. And again, you put hollow Earth into Google, and you'll see this picture comes up, and you'll find this thing called a garter. This commonly appears. A garter is said by Robert Dickoff in his book of the same title to be a vast underground terminal city. He claims it is a holy abode of the Buddhist world. But when I looked into that and I tried to find some more sort of detailed reference to that, I couldn't find any other reference to it in Buddhist sort of websites or anything like that. And it gets mixed up with Shambhala as well, apparently. It all gets mixed together, and I couldn't really, the time that I spent, I couldn't really separate the two. But nevertheless, that's not stopped this wonderful drawing by Max Fifield, which comes up, and you can see it's quite intricate. And I just made this little video here, and hopefully this one will play a bit more easily with any luck. Here we go. Name the tune. This is a sort of tour around some of the features of the hollow Earth, supposed hollow Earth. That's the surface at the top. It's also to Venus, comes out of the hollow Earth. See all these stories that you get coming out. Cold air rushes back to the Earth through a shaft. Entrances to the inner Earth. Pyramid at Giza, got one there, of course. You've got the entrance to the inner Earth at Giza, volcano coming out. And then you've got these flying saucers flying around the inside surface. Centre of gravity is 400 miles down. And then we've got the Rainbow City. Ice covering here. Small entrance apparently at the South Pole there. Got the plastic basalt rock, basalt, granite, sediment. Cave city of the semi-advanced race there. City of Shambhala, you see it comes up from a Buddhist position. Kentucky cave mouth, from the Mammoth Cave. All these things, and this is a key one. Admiral Byrd's flight, 1947. We're going to talk about that soon. Anyone know the tune? I'd be impressed if you know it. Races. So this kind of, again, I'm just trying to give you an overview of the mythology about it and what's said about it, the central sun. I thought it was such a wonderful picture, whatever you think of the story or the science or whatever, a lot of time has gone into producing that picture. I really liked it, so that's why I made a sort of little video of scanning it. It's actually Journey to the Centre of the Earth by Rick Wakeman. Okay. So yeah, just sort of there's quite a good website called Land of No Horizon. That's about a book, sorry. HollowEarthTheory.com. That has a brief history of several of the main theories. And their Hollow Earth theory includes the idea that there is an inner sun and a perfect environment for supporting life inside the Earth. The Taylors contend in their book, this Land of No Horizon book, which is not that I was going to get a copy, but they're based in Australia. It was going to cost about 30 quid to get it, or something, so it's quite expensive. They claim there's a perfect environment supporting life inside the Earth. They contend that beings thousands of years ahead of us evolved there and orchestrated humanity's development. So again, you get this idea of those beings involved with our genetic manipulation that might have come from the inside of the Earth. Because there is little to no gravity, trees and other life forms grow much taller and bigger. There is constant warmth and daylight from the radiating sun, and some of this was mentioned in that fancy video clip that I couldn't play at the beginning. And the visual perspective is much different than here, as there is no horizon, and the continents appear to float in the clouds. Planets the size of the Earth and Mars evolve to become hollow and then expand under their own gravitational power. That's according to this Land of No Horizon book. Yeah, they also related the Great Flood from the time of Noah was created by the whole Earth inhabitants who released the water in a careful manner in order to correctly imbalance and guard against a potential meteor impact. Again, sort of, I haven't read the book, so I shouldn't sort of discredit it too much, because that would be unfair. But I'm going to, go through this, what I have read up and why I think what I think. So again, one of the key stories that you come across, and I'd heard a couple of Red Ice radio broadcasts about this, and I heard about Olaf Jansen's story, and it's called The Smoke, and it was written up by Willis George Emerson, and he's a novelist, and the book was published in 1908, and by Forbes and Company in Chicago, and it's called Smoky God. And I've made this into some booklets. I read it in about 2 or 3 hours. You can read the whole thing in 2 or 3 hours. It's a very easy read, written in a sort of classical style, very enjoyable read. And the story is basically this. 3rd of April 1829, so we've got names, we've got dates and so on. Age 19, Olaf Jansen and his father set out on a trip from Stockholm, passing Gotland, Gothland, Island and Öland, that's Öland, or however you pronounce it in Swedish. And they arrived in Spitsbergen on the 23rd of June, early in the Arctic summer. So they're heading towards the North Pole. Okay? And that all looks fairly reasonable. As I say, I'll put this onto a map and try to plot it, see if it looks reasonable. And they arrived in Franz Josef Land about 30th of June. If you read through the book, and he gives you the starting date, and he says, like, we sailed this direction for 3 weeks, and then we went to sail this direction another 2 weeks. You can work out where they went, basically. Dodging icebergs and almost running out of food and water, they ended up in the land beyond the North Pole, according to what Jansen says. And this is one of the pictures that was drawn in Willis George Emerson's book. There's some lovely, sort of quite evocative pictures in there. Sailing north from the unknown land, they later entered a freshwater sea and could see a different kind of sunlight in the sky. Right? This is according to the story. They don't report getting sucked down into a hole or vortex or anything like that. And for several days, Jansen reports, when I looked at this star, it was always there directly above us. And the way that this is explained in the theory of it is that they were going down this. If you imagine that opening on top of the drawing that we saw there, they're going down into that bit of sea towards the inner Earth. So they're actually going down in altitude into the inner Earth. And they can begin to see this at some point, this supposed inner sun. That's what this is claimed to be. How this will be visible when in June at or near the North Pole, the sun is visible most of the time. So, again, were they mistaking it for the midnight sun? I don't know. They claim that they obviously wouldn't mistake the sun, but. And then they kept on sailing in north, basically, and they landed. And they were greeted by giants, and they actually ended up stopping at an island, and they were greeted by giants, and they came on this immense craft, and it paused. Almost immediately a boat was lowered, and 6 men of gigantic stature rowed to our little fishing sloop. They spoke to us in a strange language. We knew from their manner, however, that they were not unfriendly. They talked a great deal among themselves, and one of them laughed immediately, as though in finding us a queer discovery had been made. One of them spied our compass, and it seemed to interest them more than any other part of our sloop. Finally, the leader motioned as if to ask whether we were willing to leave our craft to go on board their ship. What say you, my son? Asked my father, and this is the relative size that is described. The son here and his father there. They cannot do any more than kill us, says Olaf Jansen. They seem kindly disposed, I replied, although what terrible giants. They must be the select 6 of the kingdom's crack regiment. Just look at their great size. We may as well go willingly as be taken by force, said my father, smiling, for they are certainly able to capture us. Thereupon he made known by signs that we were ready to accompany them. So they went off with these giants that they met, according to the story. And they toured the land of the inner Earth for about 2 years, according to Jansen's story. It's a pretty amazing story. But there's some interesting details. They were taken to an overland to the city of Eden, so they claim they went to the city called Eden inside the inner Earth, in a conveyance different from anything we have in Europe or America. This vehicle was doubtless some electrical contrivance, and I found this very interesting. It was noiseless and ran on a single iron rail in perfect balance. Remember, this is 1829, so where's he getting this from? And the trim was made at very high rate of speed. I won't read it all out. On top of each car were high-geared flywheels lying on their sides, which were so automatically adjusted that, as the speed of the air car increased, the high speed of these flywheels geometrically increased. These revolving fan-like wheels on top of the cars destroyed atmospheric pressure, or what is generally understood by the term gravitation, and with this force thus destroyed or rendered nugatory, the cars are safe from falling to one side or the other from the single track as if it were in a vacuum. The firewheels in their rapid revolutions destroying effectually the so-called power of gravitation. They're in an anti-gravity craft. I was just intrigued by this description. I don't know if it's true, but I was just intrigued by this quite detailed description that he come up with. I mean, maybe he read a Jules Verne book. And the story goes on. And you can, as I say, you can read it on the internet. There's lots of versions on the internet that you can get and download as PDFs. But the point was that he comes out, they sail around, and then they decide to leave. They decide to come back and tell their tale, come to the top side of the Earth. And they basically come out of the South Pole. Now, I missed this detail originally. What they say is they sailed in at the North Pole, went around the inner Earth for 2 years, and then came out of the South Pole, which, of course, that sounds a bit ridiculous to me. But the other thing that happened was he came out, and they was on the sea again. Jansen was on the sea in his ship. The hand of the deliverer was extended. An iceberg basically falls into the sea. There's a big wash, and the ship is overturned. He loses his father. His father goes beneath the waves, never to be seen again. And somehow Jansen lands up on top of this iceberg. And then he says, the hand of the deliverer is extended, and the death-like stillness of the solitude, rapidly becoming unbearable, was suddenly broken by the firing of a signal gun. I looked up in startled amazement when I saw less than half a mile away a whaling vessel bearing down toward me with her sail full set. And he was basically claims to have been rescued by this whaler. And I found it was a Scotch whaler called the Arlington, and she had cleared from Dundee in September and started immediately for the Antarctic in search of whales. So when I saw that, I thought, right, the Arlington, we've got a ship with a name, we know where it came from. He gives a date when it was supposedly come out, and he names the captain as Angus McPherson. We can check that. We can check and see if that's true. Before we go on to that, I replied that I had just come. He talks to this Angus McPherson chap and says, I've come out of the inner Earth, and the Angus McPherson says, get on with you. That's a load of nonsense. I proceeded to tell him how my father and myself had gone in by way of the Spitsbergen and come out by way of the South Pole country, whereupon I was put in irons, so they clapped him in irons. Now, he returned to Stockholm. How he got back he doesn't really say. He claims that he was incarcerated in a mental institution for 28 years. That's his story, and it makes you wonder, because he told this fantastic tale to his uncle, who then decided he must have gone mad. Perhaps because Jansen's father was killed in the voyage, that obviously played into things according to his story. In later life, after he was released from this mental hospital, this institution, or whatever you want to call it, Jansen travelled to the USA, and he accurately records the date of the second inauguration of President McKinley as March the 4th, 1901, because that was, he said, he arrived in the USA on that date. So when you're getting people putting in real dates like that, you begin to think, well, there must be something in this story, because he's not just making the whole thing up. And it appears that Jansen did not write his story down at all in full after the 28 years of horror he claimed to have suffered. He was unwilling to tell his tale to anyone in full until near his death, and he did so to Willis Emerson, and that's explained at the start of the book, how Emerson came to know the story. You can read, and Emerson tells that story in the first few pages. So it appears that Jansen never profited from his tale. He didn't write this book, he didn't try and sell it, he didn't sort of make little souvenirs of his ship, being sailing around the inner Earth. So it's a very peculiar story. So what can we establish as being true about it? Well, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, he mentioned this whaler, but Malcolm Archibald has written a book about the Scottish whaling industry, right? So I wrote to him to ask about Scottish whaling ships in the Antarctic. Because Jansen's story says he came out of the South Pole and he claims to have been picked up by a ship called the Arlington. Now, according to Malcolm Archibald, he was very quick to respond. He's one of these sort of enthusiasts about the shipping industry and so on. There were no Dundee whalers in the Antarctic in that time period. There were whalers from the United States and from London in the South Seas, based around South Georgia, the Falklands, sometimes off Stratton Island or Straiten Island off Cape Horn. But there were few and far between and concentrated on the seals. Now, that was in the 1830s, because Jansen said he set off in 1829. He was in the inner Earth for 2 years. So we're looking at around about 1831, 1832 sort of time frame for this to be when he met this Arlington ship. I can only think of one Scottish South Sea whaler that was Captain Weddell in Jane of Leith. He sailed south in 1822, and having read his journal, he made no mention of picking up a castaway. The name Angus MacPherson, I would also think, was a stock name for a Scottish seamaster, part of the tartan and shortbread image used by people with limited or no knowledge of the county. So Malcolm Archibald suggests that name was just made up. Now, we could concede that somehow Jansen got confused, and he didn't actually come out of the South Pole. He came out of the North Pole, because, as you know, the South Pole is a landmass. How did he get his ship across the 500 miles of land and back to the sea? I mean, it's just impossible. So could he have, say there was an inner Earth, could he have thought he'd come out of the South and actually have come out of the North? Well, I don't know that. We can't ask anybody that. But Malcolm could find no record of any whaler named the Arlington, and there's only about 40 of them or something, I think, which sailed out of Dundee. So there's no record of that ship at all. So I can't verify really any of Jansen's story, frankly, apart from the McKinley date, which he could have just put in there. Now, also from the book, from Jansen's book, I attempted to plot Jansen's alleged route on Google Earth, which is, it seems logical enough if you look at it. Age 19, Jansen and his father set from Stockholm, which I mentioned. So basically they came from down here, and they sailed around the coast of Sweden and Norway. That's Spitsbergen here, and this is Franz Josef Land. And here, the North Pole is up here towards the top. So I worked out that in about 10 weeks they sailed about 3,500 miles, which works out to about 50 miles a day, which of course is not unreasonable for a sailing ship. That's perfectly reasonable. So the journey itself, looks totally plausible. No problems with the sort of journey, except after leaving Franz Josef Land, they claim to have spent 1 day on an island north of Franz Josef Land, so somewhere in this region. But this island doesn't appear on any map. There is no island in that part of the world at all. That's the most northerly land. The North Pole is sea. It's frozen sea. There's no landmass there, unlike the South Pole. So again, couldn't verify that. There's no island there. At least there wasn't in there's not now. I made this little video, but I don't think you really need to see that. It's only just showing it going around in more detail. But I don't really need to show you that. Now, so we've got this claim that there are holes at the North Pole. You come across this fairly regularly. And people claim to know where these holes are. And again, I'll talk a bit more about that. Different sizes are given for the polar holes depending on what you read. On a map, the perimeter would begin at about 784 miles from Point Barrow, Alaska, and the centre of the polar opening will be located at 87.7 north latitude and 142.2 east longitude degrees from the pole. And for Point Barrow, Alaska, the perimeter would begin, so you get all these locations given, and they vary slightly, but this roughly shows where it's meant to be at the map. So it's not the exact geographic North Pole. The centre of the hole isn't the exact geographic North Pole, according to some accounts. So again, you can read up on that if you wish. Now, again, I remember seeing this image. I used to get a magazine in the 80s, a Marshall Cavendish thing called The Unexplained. I got about the first 10 issues of that. And I remember seeing one of these pictures in this. And you think, oh no, that's it. There must be the hole at the Earth is hollow. There's a hole at the North Pole. It's because we've got a satellite picture. It's obvious. It's true. And this has been used in several books. This picture on the left was taken in 1967, January 6th, and this one was 23rd of November 1968 on the right, both of the North Pole. But there are a few problems. So when you study this, you will come to that. Yeah, and there's also this, for example, this is an ESA image apparently showing this little false colour image with a hole at the North Pole. Here's Spitsbergen again, Greenland, you can see there. And it is also said that holes are shown on some photos, yeah, so holes in the poles, look folks, here you go, well yeah, it's true. But, right, let's study this a bit more closely, as I was saying. Now, the first photograph referred to by, in this one, this a book by McElwain, which was published in the 70s. The caption includes the words, clearly showing the hole at the North Pole in this book by McElwain. If this is indeed the case, then this is nothing short of remarkable, as the North Pole is in complete darkness at this time of year. So in January, the North Pole is in complete darkness, right? So how can you see, you know, all these clouds around there? And there are other extremely suspicious things about this photograph. Not just the hole, but the entire visible hemisphere of the Earth is in sunlight, right? It's not possible. You would have only half of the Earth in sunlight. So what we're looking at is not you know, just one image. You're looking at a composite image. That's the issue. If the interior of the Earth is illuminated by a glowing ball of plasma about 600 miles in diameter, why don't we see a bright disk in the centre of the dark hole? So if we are indeed looking down into it, so that's another issue. This is a composite photo. ESA 3 was a polar orbiting satellite, and this image is clearly a montage produced by NASA from a number of separate half-lit images, maybe taken over 2 or 3 days, to give a measure of global cloud cover. Right? So it's a composite image, so it's not a true image. Now, and then the second one is supposed to be November 23rd, 1968. Again, the same observations about lighting apply. January 6th is as close to the midwinter as to make no odds, and everything within the Arctic Circle should be completely hidden from view. It's not. Okay. And the long straight lines radiate from the edge of the hole at around 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock, reaching the equator, and in the case of the 7 o'clock line, considerably further, indicating this is stuck together from several smaller images. The bright rim is almost certainly an edge frame artifact from the camera rather than a physical effect, and this is, you know, these sort of effects around the edges. If there are indeed holes in the poles, why don't we see them in the pictures from July? And again, we've got some more issues with this as well as we go through some of the other data. Now, I've heard it said, in fact, I've heard Brooks Agnew say this, there are no satellite images taken over the poles. There are none. There aren't any. Well, that's just simply not true, because with a little bit of searching, I found this one. This is taken over the North Pole. Here you can see the geographic North Pole, and it is indeed covered with cloud, and it's covered with ice. And you can go there, obviously, you can go and, you know, stand on the ice there. Okay, I won't read all that text out, but it's basically, in this image, the sea of ice appears white, and areas of open water or recently refrozen sea appear black. The irregular whitish shades towards the bottom of the image are clouds, which are often difficult to distinguish from the Arctic surface. Notice the considerable number of cracks or leads in the ice that appear as dark networks of lines. Such true colour views of the North Pole are quite rare, as most of the time much of the region within the Arctic Circle is cloaked in clouds. Right? So you don't get many of these images. You do get them, but there aren't many. And obviously half the year it's in darkness anyway, so you're not going to get that many visible images. Okay, so one of the issues is with gravity. Again, there's a lot of text to read out, but massive objects tend to clump together gravitationally, creating non-hollow spherical objects we call stars and planets. The solid sphere is the best way in which to minimise the gravitational potential energy of a physical object. Having hollowness is therefore unfavourable in the energetic sense. In addition, ordinary matter is not strong enough to support a hollow shape of planetary size against the force of gravity. So that's one of the scientific arguments. I won't read all the rest of it out. And also the seismic information, which we're going to come back to, although not visually observable, the core of the Earth is observable by vibrations, primarily from earthquakes, passing from one side of the planet to the other. Using this method, geologists have been able to establish the structure of the mantle, outer core and inner core known today. A hollow Earth will behave entirely differently in terms of seismic observations, and there's one study which claims differently, which I'll come on to. But again, I'm pretty much convinced that from the seismic studies, the hollow Earth doesn't stack up. we don't have any real visual evidence. We can't verify this because, for example, I looked at what the deepest hole ever drilled was, and it's actually 7.6 miles deep. I think I've got a picture of this next. I'll come back to that. Yeah, and one of the other key things is the density, right? This is the key. This is a bit easier to sort of think about the gravity, perhaps. Because if you take this idea of the hollow Earth, this shell is just the thickness of the crust, right? And then this is just all hollow, as we've already seen. We know what the weight of the Earth is because we launch rockets and so on. We know that it orbits around the Sun. So we know that the density has got to be of a certain amount because we know the radius of the Earth. We can measure that in various different ways. So what it would work out is if you worked out, right, that all this was hollow and all the solid mass of the Earth was compressed into this section, which is either, depending on what you read, 1,400 miles thick or 400 miles thick or 700 miles thick, whatever figure you choose. Let's see. I think the figure is 300 kilometres or to 1,400 kilometres. But basically, that material there would need to be as dense as the densest element, which is osmium. So you need to have the crust, all that crust, if you want to call it the crust, is not actually what's technically called the crust. That would need to be all made of osmium to be, you know, for the Earth to be heavy enough in the way that we measure it with all the measurements that we've got. So either all the measurements that we've made are wrong, completely wrong, and the Earth is hollow, or basically most of the measurements are right and the Earth isn't hollow. So I tend to say, well, you know, at least in a physical sense, the Earth can't be hollow. It cannot be hollow. Going back to the deepest hole thing, we've got this thing in Russia, the Kola super deep borehole, 7.6 kilometres deep. So we've only got visual evidence going down that far. That's as far as anyone has drilled into the Earth. So, you know, we can't totally verify that it isn't hollow because we can't drill down far enough to find, you know, this sort of central sun. So, or whatever it is. We've only been down 7.6 miles, which is just a little way down into the crust. This was abandoned in 2005 due to lack of funding, but it's still there, the facility is still there. And they drilled down to, I think, 12.3 kilometres. And then it got too hot. And now then, yes, the other one. This is, you know, I've mentioned about holes over the poles, and I've heard these stories. They don't fly satellites over the poles, so that was one story I heard. I've shown you a picture of the pictures taken over the poles. You're not allowed to fly over the poles, apparently, according to some people. Well, since no polar orbiting satellite can go over the polar opening, the only conclusion is that the no-fly zone for polar orbiting satellites is where the polar opening is located. It is an area about 500 miles centred over the pole, down and directly over Northland, Russia. And that's from the Hollow Earth thing. So that's what they claim. There's a no-fly zone over the North Pole. Well, satellites is one thing, but what about planes? People ask if planes can fly over the poles. Apparently, it may be somewhat discouraged due to clear air directives. In other words, they don't like planes flying over the poles because they're trying to keep the air sort of more pristine over there. So I've got a friend in the States called Don Daniels, and he's a pilot and he's flown with United Airlines. And he said, I wrote to him and I said, if you can't see the hole from the satellite, then you can't see it from the plane, surely, can you? Alright? The plane is much closer to the ground, so surely you'll be able to see this. So I wrote to my friend Don Daniels, and he'd flown planes, and he said, we are not allowed to fly directly over the North Pole. The stated reason being that the older navigation systems on, for instance, the B747 would get temporarily confused as to which south to reference to. In other words, because you're going over magnetic north, they get a bit confused. Newer navigation systems on the B777 mathematically switch the poles to the equator when we are far north or south, and there is no ambiguity. However, they tell us not to not even ask, as we will not get permission to deviate directly over the pole, and it would be considered a gross navigation error. So that's from the horse's mouth. I've been within 60 miles, and this was good, because I was asking him this question. He says, I've been within 60 miles of the North Pole on a number of occasions, and while it is surprisingly smoggy or hazy, I should have been able to see an opening of any significant size. And this is where it is. Look, if you look, there it says North Pole, and he was, I think, 60 miles from it. I think it says on here somewhere 58 miles, I think. And here's he actually sent me pictures he took in the cockpit of his plane while he's flying near the North Pole. And that's his plane. Actually, that was the plane. That is the plane he was flying. That was the United Airlines plane. Because you can see the flight number on here. The flight number is given somewhere on this display. I found it. I can't remember where it is now. And that's actually the picture of the United Airlines plane that he was flying. And those are the pictures he took from when he was within 60 miles of the pole. So he should have been able to see the opening. Now, Don asked me, because he'd done me a favour and sent me those pictures. No, Don didn't see the opening. He's flown in the poles, didn't see anything. So we have no evidence from that either. Don had written this book. He wanted me to mention it because he sent me these pictures. So I'm giving him a mention. He's into all this stuff, the alien stuff, disclosure, all this stuff. Interestingly enough, he's recently published this book, Evolution Through Contact. So if you want to look at that, feel free to go and Google that and get yourself a copy. Quite an interesting book. Now then, we're out of time. We'll just do a bit on this, I think, and then maybe we'll have a break. Admiral Byrd. Again, this is, everyone knows about Admiral. If you've heard about the Hollow Earth, you've heard about Admiral Byrd and Operation Highjump. What did he discover? Right, well, I've got a 1-minute clip here. What happened was, in 1947, the US launched a well-equipped expedition to Antarctica to follow up on earlier expeditions. There were several of them. And a film was made about this called The Secret Land. It was made into a Hollywood film. It was released in 1948. And The Secret Land documents the largest expedition ever undertaken to explore Antarctica. The expedition was codenamed Operation Highjump, and it was made by the US Navy and involved 13 ships, including 1 submarine, 23 aircraft, and about 4,700 men. This is a major operation. The film was shot by photographers from all branches of the US military. One purpose of the expedition was to explore and photograph several thousand square miles of inland and coastal areas that had not been previously mapped. Remember, this is just after the Second World War, so the radar is very limited, there's no satellites. Aerial photography has been done for a few years, but still not especially advanced. Military planners wanted to evaluate whether military troops could successfully perform against an adversary in such an environment. And here's a clip. Let's see if this will play.
There is only one untouched reservoir of raw materials left in the world, and that's in the region known as Antarctica, an area larger than the combined area of the United States and Europe. The American government is sending a naval expedition to that region. The purpose is to train our Navy in polar operations so that it may better perform its function of preserving the peace upon the 7 seas of the world. Beyond that, the American government is seeking to do its share in the discovery and the release to the world of the unknown treasures of Antarctica in the interests of all mankind.
Thumbs up to this gentleman. The Secretary has approved our plan, confirming you, Admiral Byrd, as the officer in charge of the expedition, and you, Admiral Cruzen, as the task force commander. And we get everything we need. That makes Operation Highjump the greatest polar expedition in history.
Admiral, time is going to be our greatest handicap. By the time we get through this very difficult ice pack, the summer will have ended and the fall will have set in. Never before has anyone attempted to take a fleet of thin-skinned steel ships through 300 miles or more of crushing ice pack.
I have great faith in your skill, courage, and determination. Now, gentlemen.
Admiral Nimitz reviews the operations plan. The expedition will comprise 3 groups: a central land plane group to explore the interior from Little America, and 2 seaplane groups, the eastern to map that half of the continental shoreline, and the western to map the opposite coast of Antarctica. After the original orders have been issued, 3 months of planning are needed to organize the giant venture.
This is Robert Taylor speaking. At the world's greatest naval base, Norfolk, Virginia, ships of the Central and Eastern Group are loading. The flagship, Mount Olympus, equipped with powerful radio and radar, will serve as the leader's voice of command. Admirals Byrd and Cruzen come aboard to check staff preparation, food, fuel, and clothing for 4,000 men. Byrd greets staff officers who have fitted out the expedition. Not a few vessels, but a fleet. Officers and men, not hundreds, but thousands, and pilots by the score.
"1,500 miles west of Little America, the Currituck and her western group are off the Shackleton ice shelf, circling the Sunset Coast. The western group commander, Captain Bond, gives pilots and plane crews a last briefing on Antarctic dangers and the technique of survival if forced down. The flight about to start is the longest and most important so far for the western group. Before takeoff, survival gear is checked. Gear to keep 9 men alive for 100 days. Food, drugs, sleds, sleeping bags. On the water, the great TBM makes her takeoff run. Her jet assist bottles blast. She lifts quickly into the air and circles the Currituck once. Jet assist bottles, their work done, are dropped and make a salvo splash. The pilot, Commander David E. Bunger, wipes his frosted windshield, a constant source of trouble in polar flying. He is over the Shackleton ice shelf, named for the great English explorer who kept returning to the Antarctic until death, so often escaped, kept its rendezvous with him. The smooth shelf roughens. Dark rocks, called nunataks, appear above the ice. Then rugged mountain ranges as far as the eye can see. Bunger leans forward in amazement. His eyes have caught a sudden and unbelievable change in scenery. The universal white has turned to chocolate brown, dotted with blue. A cameraman goes into action. 300 square miles of land without snow. Land that might be in New Mexico or Arizona. Pictures alone will prove Bunger has discovered a warm oasis in the shadow of the pole. It is for such supreme moments as this that men brave the hardships of exploration. The astounding, undreamed-of fact is that they are over a chain of warm water lakes whose shores, except for small patches, are free of ice and snow. Commander Bunger circles the largest lake in sight, 5 miles long. He comes in to make a landing. Water temperatures must be recorded. Samples taken. He finds the water fresh, the temperature 38 degrees Fahrenheit. On the shores are vast deposits of coal and of minerals of the utmost importance to civilization.
So, basically what seems to have happened with that story, this has been muddled up in that on the web the much seems to be made of the ice-free area of land that was discovered. And they claim that this is like the warmer inner Earth. And I think that's where these stories seem to have come from for the South Pole. And then also, its bedrock had water pockets that guided the buildings of stations there. And they built stations at this Bungers Hill area. I've got it on the map on the next thing. And they also seem to be mistaken because there is actually an active volcano on Ross Island near the Antarctic South Pole. Or, well, it's probably a couple of 100 miles off. But again, that's probably a slightly warmer area that you can see where you've got warm water and things around there at times. So I think that has been mistaken. And this whole story of Admiral Byrd has been all conflated together and mixed up and muddled up because Admiral Byrd was, I found out this as well, he was a Freemason. So that's interesting, isn't it? So, you know, there may be some secrets here, I don't know. But from what I found about the actual trips, I can't find any evidence that anyone that I've been able to verify has been into the physical, what we call the physical inner Earth. Now, if you want to talk about different dimensions, that's a different story, I'm sure. But anyway, going back to the actual trips, Admiral Byrd had a flight over the North Pole in May 9th, 1926, and he did an Antarctic trip from 1928 to 1930, and another one, 1933 to 1935. And then he did Operation Highjump, 1947, and 1946, sorry. Let's see. Now, this operation, as I say, he made a big film about it. There's no secrets about it, or at least no obvious secret, not in terms of the whole thing. There's a lot of it on public record. You can go and watch this film, The Secret Land, on Google Video. The first mention of a 1947 North Polar flight by the Admiral can be found in the book Worlds Beyond the Poles, Physical Continuity of the Universe, by a controversial self-proclaimed scientist, F. Amadeo Giannini. On page 13 of his book, under the heading Changing Scene 1927 to 1947, he presents a list of things that happened during those years to support his theory. I'd like to see beyond the pole, blah, blah, blah. And he claims that Admiral Byrd flew to the pole in 1947, the North Pole. This is not possible, because he was at the South Pole then, and that's well recorded. And again, if you go through the details of this story, in 1928, Admiral Byrd published an account of the 1926 flight that he went on, right, in a book entitled Skyward. And on page 196, Byrd reveals the following information. When our calculations showed to us about an hour from the pole, I noticed through the cabin window a bad leak in the oil tank of the starboard motor. When I took the wheel again, I kept my eyes glued on the oil leak and the oil pressure indicator. And then compare this information to the following passage from the so-called secret diary, which is the book referenced in the 1947 book. And it's basically this hours. Slight oil leak in starboard engine, oil pressure indicator seems normal, however. So it's like he's copied the 1926 account into this alleged 1947 account. He's merged the two together. And then also in this 1947 account, he's written down Admiral Byrd went into the inner earth, he met these people, and one of this group of people said to him, the master tells Admiral Byrd, a dark time is coming, but that you, my son, said the master, will live through the storm. You will preserve the fragrance of our history and add to it a touch of your own mind. Beyond that, my vision weakens, but I can see a great distance, a new world starting in the ruins. You know, so one of these lurid stories of upcoming events and so on. But that was from a film called Lost Horizon, right? But in this supposed secret diary, it says of Admiral Byrd, it says, yes, my son, replied the master, the dark ages that will come from your race will cover the earth like a pall, but I believe that some of your race will live through the storm. Beyond that, I cannot say. We see a great distance, a new world stirring from the ruins of your race. So it's like he's copied that 1948 account from the MGM film script. So we can see there's evidence there that this is a made-up story, and the things have been muddled together, merged together, and it took somebody quite a while to sort that out. So, I think probably we'll have a break there, but that's just basically to say that what we're seeing is a pattern forming now. All of the stories about hollow Earth and holes at the poles, I've not been able to verify, almost in no conceivable way. But I've got a little bit more on that, and we'll cover that in the second half. So we'll have a break now, maybe like 15-20 minutes, and then we'll come back some more.
Let's say thank you very much.
I've been told I've got to stand at this side now, so thank you very much, everybody. You may be aware that Michael Palin went to the South Pole and he went to the North Pole as well. I think he became, I forget the figure, but it's one of about 50 people who've been to both poles or something. I'll come on to that. But basically, before, I think I put the slide in the wrong order, but the Bunker's Hill thing that we looked at, it became the site of bases. So there is this area in the Antarctic, which is like an oasis, it's warmer, and they've settled bases there, and it has a freshwater lake, which you wouldn't expect in the middle of the Antarctic, would you? But there it is. It is there. Let's see. Should be going on to the next slide. I'm not going to bother with that. Yes, I'm just going to play this clip because there's an interesting clip from pole to pole. See if I think this will come up properly. Excuse the fiddling. Excuse the play. Please play. It's not doing very well in my video. Let's try. Go back to one. Shouldn't be causing all these problems. Is that it? That's it. Thank you. It's sluggy.
Pressurized cabin. We're at the equivalent of 15,000 feet above sea level. Rudy especially is finding breathing hard in the thin air. Scott administers oxygen. Slowly and uncomfortably, we draw nearer to the pole.
South Pole, 58 Juliet Hotel, do you copy, over?
58 Juliet Hotel, South Pole.
Roger, we're about 15 minutes out, inbound, how's your weather?
I have a couple of pieces of information for you. When you land on the skiway, you'll see a number 9 marker and recommend to pull off well off the runway and park the plane there. How copy?
Yeah, you're coming in 5 square there.
Roger that, and I've got one more little piece of information here. There is no certified runway or airfield available, and the U.S. government cannot authorize a landing. How copy?
Roger, we copy that.
Okay, have a good landing.
So we're brought down to Earth. The goal of our 5.5-month journey is within our grasp, but the radio conversation with the base is a reminder of an awkward truth. No one really wants us here.
Well, here it is. We've landed at the South Pole, or at least tantalizing close. The only thing is I don't quite know where the pole is. So I'd better go and ask.
This is definitely not what I expected. It's a cross between the moon and a marshalling yard in the Midwest. I see domes and aerials and dishes and pylons, but I see no pole. How ironic it is that at the centre of the world's most unspoilt wilderness, the needs of science have created a building site. But where's the pole? Perhaps it's kept indoors, to stop it getting knocked over by bulldozers. Only one way to find out. This is the heart of the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, established by the Americans 35 years ago. It's an extraordinary feat, proving that even at the most inhospitable place on Earth, life as we know it can survive. Outside, the temperature is 30 below. In here, they can wear Bermuda shorts and eat chili and blueberry pie. This summer, there's a record number of 120 scientists working here. One of them must know where the pole is.
Keep going.
Well, now I know where it is, but not which one it is. Surely this can't be it, all gaudy like a fairground attraction. Thankfully not. This is what they call the ceremonial pole. Politicians who get this far like to be photographed here. At last I see it. And at last I'm on the point of joining the select ranks of those who have done what Scott and Amundsen never did. Stand on both poles.
At this point, all the world's lines of longitude converge on my toe caps. It's impossible to go further south than this. Every direction you go in will be north. At this point, I can actually warp right around the world in 8 seconds, as I will now demonstrate. It is the end of the world. It's also the end of our harebrained migration from north to south. I think the omens are telling us to stop. Just a while ago, the camera packed up because of the cold, and as you can tell, I'm beginning to pack up because of the cold too. It's minus 30 degrees centigrade here. With wind chill, that's about minus 50. We're also at an elevation of 9,000 feet, so there's altitude sickness to combat. But I think it's just that after 5.5 months on the road, the body is finally saying, pack it in.
When I was a boy in Sheffield, I dreamed of coming here, like...
So basically you can see that he was at the South Pole. There's no hole there either that we can see. The base is obviously pretty impressive, and there are claims that the base goes 7 levels underground, according to David Hatcher-Childress. And the interesting note was he wasn't welcome. They didn't get permission to land. Obviously they had to land because they had to refuel. They couldn't have flown back, but the Americans didn't give them permission. I hear these stories about it being international, sort of land ownership and so on, but he wasn't welcome at that base. They had to, I think part of the other another part of the problem is they sleep in a tent. They don't let them sleep inside. I think they end up sleeping in a tent or something. So they weren't welcome there at all. So that's quite interesting. You saw the extent of those supplies and so on there. It was like a building site. It's pretty amazing. Okay, auroras and seismic data. We'll look quickly at that. Some people have said that, as you saw the Edmund Halley thing, said that aurorae came out of the poles, and that was coming out of the holes in the earth and so on. And this was something that Brooks Agnew talked about. I've probably got a clip of him, but I might skip this because I want to get onto the expanding Earth a bit more. Basically what NASA did is they wanted to understand more about how the Aurora Borealis and the Aurora Australis, they wanted to understand how those things are working and what effects are generated and so on. And they launched this Themis, which is 5 identical probes which they launched in orbit, and they put them at different distances out from the Earth. And then when what's called a coronal mass ejection comes in, which is a stream of material coming from the Sun, and there's a lot more being talked about those more recently in the last 2 or 3 years, these probes will detect the coronal mass ejection interacting with Earth's magnetic field, and that is what is meant to trigger an aurora. They don't quite understand how auroras actually happen, because they should happen sometimes and don't, and then they happen more powerfully sometimes when they shouldn't. So, yeah, what basically Brooks Agnew said was that on December 2011, Brooks Agnew is a PhD physicist based in the US. Now, he said that what he wanted to do as part of this North Pole Inner Earth expedition, which I'll mention in a minute, they want to go and look at the Northern Lights, study them with various cameras and so on, because he was claiming that one of the theories is that a cosmic bullet explodes between 2 of these satellites, which they use to detect the aurorae, the Themis satellites. And he said that he disagreed with NASA because they only made 1 measurement from this Aurora project, the Themis project, to measure the aurorae. He said, well, I don't believe that NASA's explanation about the aurorae is correct because they only made 1 measurement. However, what I found is when I checked out on this, the thing is not called a cosmic bullet. Brooks Agnew got that wrong. It's actually called a plasma bullet. If you look at the NASA paper, it's called a plasma bullet, not a cosmic bullet. Also, they did several more measurements, not just 1. So in other words, he was claiming that this was evidence for the hollow Earth, but the facts that he actually stated on air were not correct. And he's supposed to be a PhD scientist. I haven't got a PhD, but I do check details. So this guy is coming out with these facts, and I don't think he should have mistaken a cosmic bullet and a plasma bullet for somebody like him. I can't put that down to an innocent mistake. So this idea that the aurorae are in effect of the hollow Earth, again, I couldn't really say that I could give any credence to that particularly either. I've got an audio clip, but I won't bother playing the clip. I'll try and go on to the next slide. Yeah, and this is one of the lurid pictures that you see again. You Google hollow Earth, this will come up. He's doing this North Pole Inner Earth expedition, the greatest expedition in the history of the world. Geologists have been aided by internet linking of seismographic accelerometers to conduct a CAT scan of the Earth each time there is an earthquake. Of course, like most modern scientists, they mould the data to fit their current paradigm. In other words, he's arguing that the Earth is hollow. More than 600,000 seismograms have been recently analysed by Dr. Michael Wyersons and revealed an entire ocean beneath the Atlantic Ocean, but that's not the same as a hollow Earth. There may indeed be a layer of water below the ocean bed, but that isn't the same as a hollow Earth. So that's what he says on his webpage. I can have a look at, yeah. And this also got quite a lot of press. Jan Lamprecht is a South African guy, and this is what was flashed up in that hollow Earth video at the beginning, this picture here. And basically, when there's an earthquake, obviously you get these shock waves travelling through the solid mass within the Earth, right? And they measure these with what are called seismometers, these very sensitive instruments which measure very small amounts of vibration. And these are sited all around the Earth, and the USGS, the US Geological Survey, they have a network of them. You know, we have similar things in Britain that are monitored by British universities and so on. And you can carefully model in a computer how these waves will travel through different types of rock, through a molten rock, through solid rock and different layers and so on. And they claim that they've mapped out the sort of shape of the core and the dynamics of it from multiple. You can get earthquakes all the time. You maybe get 100 earthquakes a day. You know, probably more. I don't know what the exact figure is. So you can get a lot of data from this. Now, what this Jan Lamprecht fellow did is he took one of the mysteries is you get this shadow wave, and you get these waves coming. Where you get an earthquake here, you get a wave travelling up to here, and then you get these waves refracted and refracted again, so they come out the opposite side of the planet. And he claimed to have modelled a way of explaining this shadow, which wasn't a molten core, it was caused by a hollow Earth. And he developed this software with his friend that you could trigger a mathematical version of an earthquake and see these shock waves travelling through, and he explained this shadow zone. That was his whole bag. But so what? I mean, that's just one particular set of computer model. It's proof by computer modelling. You know, it doesn't prove that the Earth is hollow. All it proves is that he's managed to tweak the parameters of his model to match what's observed by the data, in the data. But it doesn't prove that the Earth is hollow. So when you actually study that, I wasn't convinced that explained that proved that the Earth was hollow. There's no way. You need to do much more than that. So the hollow Earth conclusions, one of the claims is there are no satellite pictures of the poles. That's false. I've shown you pictures over the poles. Admiral Byrd's story, he went to the inner Earth, he met these people. As far as I can tell, that's all been muddled up. Through 2 or 3 stories all mixed together, so I couldn't verify that. The supposed land he discovered is called Bunger's Hill, and it's been mapped, and a station and a base was built there, so that's already known about. So this idea of a warmer area is a perfectly well established fact. The details in Olaf Jansen's story remain interesting, and I can't totally discount it. Something very odd may have happened to him. He may have been through some dimensional portal which took him into another realm or something, and this has happened to people, like, apparently. So, you know, something like that could have happened, but the important details are either wrong or can't be verified, or the chap that wrote up his story, George Willis Emerson, made them up, possibly. That's another explanation. And if the Earth was hollow, then the alleged solid part would be extremely dense. That's one problem. If it is indeed the Earth's mass which creates the gravity centred around in it or on it. In other words, if we go by the theory of mass creating gravity, because the Earth is a large mass, then the Earth can't be hollow. But if there's some other explanation for gravity, not quite as straightforward as that, then there's still a chance it could be. So overall, the likelihood of the Earth being hollow is not supported by the preponderance of the evidence. That was the conclusion I came to in studying this probably over a period of 2 or 3 months. So we'll now move on to the second half, and I'll probably skip through this quite quickly, but this becomes much more compelling when you look at it. The expanding Earth, which less people talk about. A lot of people talk about the hollow Earth. Very few will talk about the expanding Earth. Now, and this, you've got a much more scientific basis for this. I mean, you've probably seen these pictures. They put these on the BBC regularly. I won't read out all the text, but basically you've got this idea that the Earth is a constant size, always has been. It was formed from hot, it was hot, formed out of material from the sun, or material which is accreted in the solar system. Then it cooled, and then we had this, one time we had this gigantic supercontinent called Pangaea, surrounded by basically nothing. And then this Pangaea apparently broke up, and slowly over time we've got this idea of continental drift, which wasn't accepted as fact until well into the 1950s. It was assumed that even until the 1950s that the continents were fixed and never moved. So when we began to measure that they did actually move, that it began to be accepted. And it was in the early 1900s that Alfred Wegener proposed the idea of this continental drift, which is what's taught in schools. I was taught it in my geography lessons. But originally it wasn't accepted. It was only accepted in 1950s. Now I've got this animation of this, what happened to Pangaea. I picked this up off the internet. And what you've got to watch is where India comes into this. I think I've run this run through a couple of times, backwards and forwards. This is millions of years ago. So it's 100 million, 80, 70 million, so on. I see, if you watch India, the way India goes like supersonic speed from this bit, zooms up and crashes. Watch it again. Just watch this way what India does. This is apparently what they say really did happen. It looks like it looks like the top of your soup or whatever. The croutons on your soup, isn't it? Which they would say about an analogy, because you've got this floating mantle, you've got the molten core, and then you've got the crust floating on top. But we just watch India, I'm just coming back now, just watch this. This is brilliant. You sure that's supersonic and just crashes into there and sticks on there. It's fantastic now, isn't it? But that's what they say really did happen. That's the official stuff that's taught in universities and stuff. And I think we've got another one here. This is another version. I've got this full screen. Just do it. I mean, okay, we're looking at a long time period, so it's obviously that's artificial. We're looking at 100 million years of history compressed into like 10 seconds or something. But the basic idea is that we have a supercontinent. It broke up, and then that's what we've got now. But now we're going to look at what the Earth has really happened to the Earth. Now, one of the problems which came about was when they started to measure. This is the key fact in all of this, which is from their own sets of data. One of the big problems that came about was when they started to measure the age of the ocean floor. How do you measure the age of the ocean floor? Well, I've probably got some of the slides to explain this as well, but basically it's hopefully reasonably straightforward to explain. This, as you see, is the globe here. The continents are in white, if you can't see this too well. You've got these sort of blood red lines here. Those are the boundaries between the oceanic plates, as they're called, which make up the Earth's crust, right? And what they found was that they could date these rocks by measuring the magnetic field in the little magnetic crystals of, I think it's iron oxide, in the actual rock, or hematite, one of the magnetic ores anyway. And so they basically get samples from the seabed, and they could measure the age, and also they can use magnetometers by dropping them down into the deep ocean, like a compass, very sensitive compass needle, and they measure which way the needle goes, and they can measure magnetic reversals in the Earth's magnetic field, which happen, I think, every 500,000 years or something, or 50,000 years. So the north magnetic pole becomes the south magnetic pole, and the south magnetic pole becomes the north magnetic pole. And that switch happens about every 50,000 years. Okay? So they measured this in these rocks, and the basic conclusion was that the oldest rock on the ocean floor is only 180 million years. Alright? So all that rock has come from somewhere in the last 180 million years, and yet the age of the Earth, according to the science books, is 4 billion years. Right? But the ocean floor is newer. So when this was discovered, because they did this study as a study of plate tectonics, when you're talking about plate tectonics now, they don't talk about this. They won't talk about this. Because plate tectonics, which is just the basic, Earth is always a constant size, and the continents drift around, crashing into each other every so often. Can't explain this. You look at this bit here, and that's the oldest bit of ocean floor. Where is it? Well, looks to me like the Mediterranean, or maybe it's the Red Sea in that area. That's the oldest bit of the ocean floor, and that's right in the middle of all the landmass. What's all this? What's all this around here? So, and that was the other question that came up in my mind, which I still answered. This has really raised another question in my mind. Where did the oceans come from? Because if you go and read books about dinosaurs, it will say in those textbooks, the Earth only had shallow seas at the time of the dinosaurs. It had no deep oceans. So where did all the water come from? Where did all, and the other thing, why are the oceans salty? Remember, fresh water falls onto land and washes into the ocean, doesn't it? But most of the rocks, there's not much sodium and not much chlorine in the rocks on land. So where does all the sodium chloride come from? That's another mystery. And I was looking at that, and I came across this, Immanuel Velikovsky, if anyone's read his books. Very controversial figure. And of course, they had to get Carl Sagan in to debunk him. This guy wasn't a physicist, but he was coming out, he's come out with some amazing predictions, Velikovsky, about Venus, particularly, which is interesting to read about. However, scientists today know that this is only part of the answer. For example, there is hardly any chlorine or sulfur in most rocks, so those elements couldn't come from weathering. They come from volcanoes, which spew out gases containing sulfur and chlorine, as well as lava. So how come rivers which contain fresh water flow into the sea, which is salty? I wasn't really... Where did the salt come from? Icebergs are also mainly fresh water. Why aren't they salty? It's something you never really think of. And when I looked for information on this, it was a paper that came up by Immanuel Velikovsky. He's the only one to look at this question of why the oceans are so salty. Obviously you can expect a bit of salt, but they seem disproportionately salty. And the claim is that if you get an iceberg, they claim that basically icebergs are formed from frozen snow at the pole, because most of them is snow falling at the poles. It forms icebergs. But they claim also that if you freeze salt water in your fridge, but then it says you have to dilute it, then you'll end up with a freshwater ice cube. And he says you can perform this experiment. But where did the fresh water for the lower parts of an iceberg come from? How come that what's under the sea isn't frozen salt water? It's not really. It's a bit of a mystery, really. I'm not totally convinced by the explanation. And this is a famous picture. You might have seen this picture before. I've just got it in a few emails. But I'll just put a note in about this, because I remember this picture and I wanted to check, because that to me didn't look real. Because how would you illuminate an iceberg from the underneath? You needed a massive, huge spotlight. That's actually a composite image. It's not a real image. So if you see that picture, it isn't real. And it was sent around as a real image, saying, "Oh, this guy's a clever photographer." Well, I'm sorry, he is. He's just used Photoshop, and it's not a real picture. So that's just a note on that picture. Right. Expanding Earth in the history of science. So we've seen that this continental drift looks a bit dodgy, to say the least. But as long ago as 1858, people observed the east-west fit of a continent. You've all seen this, you've all thought this, and looked at the globe and thought, oh yeah, South America fits into Africa, no problem. So you always see that, and you can see it sort of in this area as well. But what is less obvious is the east to west fit across the Pacific. The Atlantic fit is obvious, but the Pacific one isn't. The idea of one continent breaking up was first proposed by Alfred Wegener in the German Geological Society in 1912, right? When it was discovered that the continents are moving slowly, this had to be explained. Even in the 1950s, as I said, it was regarded as ridiculous. The continental drift was nonsense in the 50s. And one of the early proponents of this continental drift was Professor S. Warren Carey of the University of Tasmania. But he later went on to document the evidence for the expanding Earth, because he realised that that was the correct explanation. From Dr. J. Marvin Herndon's website on the whole Earth decompression dynamics, which I'll mention in a few minutes, Otto C. Hilgenberg published his idea in 1933 that in the distant past, for some unknown reason, the Earth was smaller, without ocean basins, that subsequently the Earth expanded. An alternative to the plate tectonics theory was Earth expansion theory, as disproved by S. Warren Carey. So it went back to 1933. That's when somebody started to look at how all these continents would fit together on a smaller globe, much more accurately. And that was Otto C. Hilgenberg. And then Warren Carey sort of, he actually, you can see we've got a good representation of the South America and Africa fit. And he mentions theories of the Earth and the universe, a history of dogma in the Earth sciences, how he first fitted together these continents in 1933 before he realised that the Earth was expanding. So he did that in 1933. Okay? And he writes there, I fitted them at 1,000 fathom isobar on an oblique stereographic projection in 1933 before I realised that the Earth is expanding. Although I placed the northwest angle of Brazil as close as I could to the Gulf of Guinea, I could not eliminate the residual gaps tapering in both directions resulting from the Earth expansion. In other words, these continents, in other words, we've got this idea we have Pangaea which broke up. So in other words, they were all joined together. But you can only explain that join on a smaller diameter Earth, because the fit that they used to make it back to Pangaea doesn't work on the current size globe. It's not accurate enough. But when you say the Earth is expanding, it does fit. The evidence actually turned out is overwhelming. We've got, Professor Warren Carey, continental drift. Mental models bias our thinking, and continental drift hobbled Wegener's concept in the English reading world from the outset. Wegener's word was I can't pronounce it because I don't know any German, Verschiebung, which was correctly translated by Skirl as displacement. Drift was substituted by detractors, and as they were the majority, the term gained currency. The theory saddled with that name was successfully slanted towards fantasy. So in other words, it should have been continental displacement, which is a more scientific word than drift, which means aimless, don't really know what you're talking about. So it's another one, of these things like the name that was given cold fusion. It was given that name to distract from the way it wasn't actually meant to be that. It was meant to be low energy nuclear reactions. Same thing happened with this. And Warren Carey, he writes that he wrote about continental drift. His paper was accepted. Years later, he wrote about the expanding Earth and the evidence for that in a very detailed manner. That was rejected. They published stuff about continental drift, not about expanding Earth. You can't get papers published about that. It's changing a bit now, actually, I found out. But you couldn't get it published even a few years ago. There's still hostility towards it. Now, if you Google expanding Earth, you'll come across this fellow, Neal Adams, who's not a scientist. He's received quite a lot of prominence, but he's not a scientist. And he's done a lot of work on the Batman comics and stuff. And he basically slags off continental drift.
This is our Earth. We will be going back in time and watching the tectonic movements of the last 200 million years. We will not be applying subduction, rotation of continental plates, reducing, enlarging, sinking or rising of plates, and only such turning, rotation as is justified by magnetic striping, like the rotation of Spain, Great Britain, and Central America. This Earth globe will reduce in size to accommodate the reductions of all the oceanic plates as clearly indicated by the rainbow map of the United States Geological Survey. This being the case, it would be impossible for these upper continental plates to fit together perfectly, and yet they fit together perfectly. We invite close scrutiny. Yes, there has been some erosion, landslides, and such, but the overall result is insignificant. We have been asked to believe that the continental plates drift about willy-nilly, bumping and crashing into each other like bumper cars in a carnival. This does not happen. Continental plates never collide. They only move apart, ever. In actual fact, they don't really move at all. The rifts of the lower oceanic plates move apart as the Earth fills and grows. Do the upper tectonic plates match perfectly in the Pacific as well as the Atlantic? Yes. Do plants and trees match across the North Pole in type and kind? Yes. Why is this obvious conclusion not considered by the geological community? Perhaps it is because the ramifications are so staggering to all scientists across all the areas of science. The outer 2.5 miles thick of crust of an early Earth, though slowly stretching, was all one piece, until the rate of growth grew too fast for the brittle crust, and 180 million years ago it began to profoundly crack and spread deep over the entire planet. We are now going forward in time to show how the actual growth of the Earth took place. Antarctica 200 million years ago was subtropical. Africa, rising up on a smaller globe, was originally way down under the globe. In fact, for 100 million years, Africa was the South Pole. South America's tail went under and wrapped around the bottom of Africa, then incredibly joined coast with Antarctica. 65 million years ago and more, these continents were joined, and monotremes, like the duck-billed platypus, roamed from Australia, Antarctica, and across southern South America and up into Africa. The platypus. Dinosaurs roamed all over this world on the upper tectonic plate because there were no oceans, just shallow seas. Here today, Antarctica is frozen over, and Australia and surrounding islands are the remaining home of monotremes and marsupials. Do you see how broadly the Pacific Ocean is opening as compared to the Atlantic? This is exactly why the knee-jerk Pangea theory exists. The Pacific spread is too difficult to visualize because it's so big. The Atlantic spread is so obvious that a child can recognize it. But they are the same. On this small planet were the shallow seas that covered 2/3 of the continental plates and have since completely drained off into the newly rifted open deep oceans. These shallow seas on the continental plates hold every scrap of evidence ever discovered of ancient sea life of the Earth. Those shallow seas are completely gone now, completely drained off into the new rifted open deep oceans, lowering the actual sea level by 1/2 mile. Is this possible? The oceans have absolutely nothing to do with tectonic spreading, except that they cool the thickening mantle. Tectonic spreading, even according to the most conservative scientists, has created 2/3 of the Earth's surface in the last 200 million years. And therefore, the same must be true on all planets. Now I'm going to run the Atlantic and Pacific without rotating the planet. Honestly, there's no tricks here. I did nothing while the other side was turned away. Please examine this carefully. The outer, upper tectonic plates, the land fits together like a pulled-apart puzzle. No exceptions. There is simply no doubt of any sort that these land masses fit perfectly on a smaller planet. All our natural history tells us this. No ancient oceans existed. Now drained shallow seas hold the only undersea history that exists on Earth. Antarctica was subtropical. There were no frozen poles before 60 million years ago. If Earth was always the size it is today, we've got a problem, because 2/3 of the upper tectonic plate is missing. If subduction existed, and it doesn't, it simply cannot and does not explain anything at all. The evidence is overwhelming. It simply needed collecting and demonstrating. The Earth grew. No Pangea, no Gondwana, Laurasia, or Tethys Sea. No meteorite knocked off the dinosaurs, no vacuum in space, no Big Bang. If what you see before your eyes right here is true, the Emperor has no clothes, and everything in science must change.
I'll move on from that because there's more evidence to look at, because looking at it visually is one thing, just because something looks like it's real doesn't necessarily mean it is real. And fortunately there is much more evidence to support this expanding Earth. And what I found is that Neal Adams, it comes up very quickly on the internet, but I think if I go on to the I'm going to go on to James Maxwell, he doesn't come up. Neal Adams is not a scientist. He just made that nice animation, and it is very good. You can clearly see that it's true, right? James Maxwell, who did his PhD on the expanding Earth in about 2003, I think, or 2002, his name hardly ever comes up when you look for this. I had to go hunt for him. But here we go, look, our planet's waistline is mysteriously increasing. What happened is, you can't read all this text, but this was, I think this was published in 1998, was it? 2002 this was published, this article. Secular variation in nature, which is the prestigious science journal, secular variation of the Earth's gravitational harmonic J2 coefficient from Lagos and non-tidal acceleration of Earth rotation. So it's a scientific journal. And what they found was that they detected by what are called geodetic measurements, they've had satellites in orbit now, able to measure the size of the Earth. Guess what? The equator has increased in size by 18 millimetres in about 18 millimetres per year over the last 10 to 12 years when they've had these measurement equipment set up and going. Guess what? There is now, for example, the International School of Geophysics 37th Interdisciplinary Workshop on Earth Expansion Evidence. There's a whole field of scientific study now which is looking into this. It's sort of a bit outside academia, but it's still getting there. And that happened in October last year. Now and again, this is another model which was done independently of the Neal Adams one. This was done by a chap called Stephen Durrell. And he spent quite a lot of time developing this model on his computer. And again, you can see he's fitted together all the continents. Consider how unlikely it is that the entire ancient ocean floor fits together so precisely to form a complete sphere on the ancient Earth. If the ancient ocean floor had been generated by any other process than an expanding Earth, it would be improbable that the areas were the exact shapes required to reconstruct a smaller Earth. Surely it would be more likely that irregular shapes that didn't fit together would exist. In other words, if you take that map, those coloured areas where you saw on the original one, the blood red lines, you take all that away and reduce the size of the globe, everything fits together perfectly. So all the ocean floor is the expansion of the Earth. That's what it is. All of it. So then you come to James Maxwell, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. In his PhD research, Maxwell considered the evidence of ancient climate, coal deposits and fossils, ancient magnetic poles. He found out where the north and south magnetic pole were. He traced those on the globe, and that all fits. He looked at ancient geography, how things fit together, ancient biogeography, ancient coral reefs. So he worked out where the coral reefs would have been on the globe, and that all matches up, because the coral reefs can only exist within 30 degrees of the equator because of the climate and so on. And he worked that out, that all fits. And he worked out that the Earth had been expanding 24 millimetres a year. And it was recently stated that these measurements show a rate of 18 millimetres a year, which is in the same ballpark as Maxwell had independently calculated. So 22, not 24. He concludes that the Earth's mass, the amount of material which is made of, has also increased. Now this is a problem. Where is all this extra Earth coming from? Where is it coming from? That still remains unexplained. Nobody's got an explanation for that yet. Well, Stephen Durrell has, I should say. So this is a picture. I mean, you can see these are basically, this is some of Maxwell's work. This is a summary of his work. He basically made all these globes by modelling the globe with different ages of ocean floor on it, and he matched up where the continents were. I've got again a video that he's done. I think, yeah. This is the magnetic south pole which he did on his globe, and he shows you where it moved around. This isn't quite as clear as the Neal Adams one, but this has scientific data. All these different colours are plots from geological rock types. So he's plotted all the different types of geological rock on a globe and matched them up. The white is Antarctica. That's what they don't know what the geology is under there, so it's not being mined. But he's mapped where the North Pole was based on the magnetic field in the rocks that have been found, and that all fits as well. So every bit of data that he's looked at, expanding, shows the Earth is expanding. And this video just plays a couple of times. So if you watch this whole video, it's on, there's a 10-part, 40-part YouTube video where you can go and watch all of this, and he explains it all. It's a little bit difficult to follow, but you can see that he's done the measurements, he's looked at the data. Now, one of the things that comes up with plate tectonics is this idea of subduction, because, you see, they know that new ocean floor is being created, right? We've established that. You can see it coming out in ripples, right? You can see these vents, and the volcanic vents are coming up, and the rock's coming out and solidifying and cooling and going outwards. So if the Earth is a constant diameter, at some other point on the Earth's surface, the oceanic plate has to be going downwards and being destroyed because the Earth has to maintain a constant diameter. So this is why they have to have subduction. They have to say that when two oceanic plates collide, the younger of the two plates, because it is less dense, will ride over the edge of the older plate, right? So they're claiming that the older plate will go under the newer one, and then it'll be destroyed. But that's just a theory. There's actually no evidence that supports that. When you study it, there's no evidence that subduction even happens. They claim that it does, but it actually doesn't. If you look at the evidence in terms of volcanic activity, it's no different from where the ocean floor is being created. And then you've got where they claim that it's happening. Towards the end, really, but where they claim that this subduction is happening is in the Mariana Trench. But again, if you look at the actual way that they say it's happening and what's actually being observed there, it doesn't really stack up at all. So on his website, I've got this in the booklet there, he comparison of expansion tectonics and plate tectonics. So he looks at all what plate tectonics will tell you, and the bits of stuff that it can't explain, and then he takes you to the expansion tectonics with the expanding Earth, and he looks at what that can explain, and basically can explain many more phenomena. Let's see if this will play. Are you going to play? This is going to play for me. Seems to be a bit naughty tonight. Well, what I'm going to do is, because we're getting short of time, I'm not going to fiddle with it. Basically, one of the interesting things that Maxwell does is, if you imagine the Earth expanding, right, the diameter is changing, then the curvature of the continental plates also changes, right? So you're getting a very curved continental plate, the globe expands, and therefore the continental plate is then less curved. And that causes these mountain ranges to collapse, because you're going from a very curved arc to a less curved arc, and then the less curved arc will collapse in from the gravity. So that explains the formation of certain mountain ranges, because the continental plate is actually sitting on a larger globe. So it explains that as well. And the other one, of course, is, well, there's this big mystery that we've all been thinking about since we were kids, or I have. Why on earth are the dinosaurs so big? They grew to enormous size. We have no land animals that are comparable in size. Only sea animals. The blue whale is some of the dinosaurs were, but of course that has less weight to carry because it's supported by water, of course, so they can say that. And there's one, I came across this other problem, for example, a Brachiosaurus. If you look at these Brachiosaurus fossils, and they work out how big they were, like, I don't know, whatever it was, I haven't got a measurement on here. I don't know, they were 60 feet long, I haven't got a measurement on here, but I just put this in for reference. They worked out that its neck was so high that its heart had to be huge to pump the blood up to the top of its head to keep it alive. So then they said, oh, well, it never raised its head, it must have been like this on the ground all the time. Yeah. And stuff like that. Or it had 3 hearts to pump the blood up in stages, and there's no evidence for that. And also, the legs are not strong enough. So if you look at the way these joints are, work mechanically, and the load that they could have taken, in fact, I think, yeah, this is on a web page I found. Somebody's worked out the mechanical load, the surface area of the bones of the dinosaurs, worked out their supposed weight. They couldn't have supported their own weight. They wouldn't have been able to walk. Now I read this book, Dinosaurs and the Expanding Earth, by Stephen Hurrell. He lives near Chester, actually. Now, he writes, let's see, yeah. He basically, he's an engineer, so he's looked at sort of these things like surface area, weight ratios and so on. And he's illustrated the most likely explanation of the size of the dinosaurs is, guess what? A reduced force of gravity at the Earth's surface. Lower gravity. Such a thing, of course, is a scientific heresy, because there is no known way that this could occur. Basically, gravity has been the same since 4 billion years ago, and that's the end of story. But he calculates, for example, if you look at the volume of something and the width of something. In other words, if you double the, let's see, yeah. Hurrell shows the simple problem of how weight increases with volume. So an animal of double a given length would have 8 times the volume of body mass, right? So if you double its length, you're 8 times heavier. So these dinosaurs were double the length, and they were 8 times heavier than they were now. The stress on the bones will be twice as great because of the surface area of those. And these factors affect how big life forms can grow. And you've got these, for example, the other fossils, what's the other one? I forget the name of it. Quetzalcoatlus. This was a huge sort of bird thing. And the author produced values that fell in the range of 500 kilograms or 2 tons, thus arriving at a rough estimate of 700 kilograms. With a 12-metre wingspan and a chest cavity larger than that of a horse, there was no getting the fact that this thing was a huge animal. The paleontologists need to do some explaining as to how muscle, bone and other bodily parts of the Quetzalcoatlus could have density even 7 times less than what is found in present-day birds. In other words, these birds, if you do the calculations, couldn't have flown, yet they did fly. It's clear that they did fly and they had wings. And this thing, which was Argentatus, that was a bird which flew as well, and you can see the size of it. How could this thing have flown? The gravity must have been lower. That's the only explanation. Same with the insects. This is a dragonfly at the time. That's how big it was. That's a scale model based on the fossil. And these insects, which I think were, how big were these? Arthropluria was a relative of centipedes and millipedes. It grew to over 2 metres in length. How can it have got so big? How can it? Because the force of gravity was lower. That's why. So why didn't its exoskeleton collapse under its own weight? Because the force of gravity was lower. Simple as that. I'm not going to read all this, I'm out of time really. But yeah, I will do this slide. I wrote to this fellow, I came across this. So he basically, how would the Earth expand? How can it possibly have expanded since it was formed? Surely it's just got to be a solid mass. Where does all this extra mass come from? And he claimed that one explanation would be that the Earth formed as like a gas giant originally. And so you had this huge atmosphere pressing down on the Earth and compressing it. So the core was very dense. I quite like this idea. So you had this huge gaseous atmosphere pressing onto the Earth's core and compressing it in. And then what happens at an unspecified point in the past is there was what's called a sort of super, what do they call it? Oh, I forget what they call it. An XZ Tauri event. T-Tauri solar winds. And what basically at the start, the sun flared up, a huge amount of gas came off, stripped off the atmosphere. You see this animation that he's got here. And the gas atmosphere was blown off into space, leaving the solid core, which then began to slowly expand because it didn't have the outer gas surrounding it. But that doesn't explain everything, unfortunately. I wrote to him and basically asked him a few questions, but he unfortunately didn't reply. Because that would mean that the Earth was essentially a constant mass, and it hadn't. When the expansion started, the mass couldn't have changed, so the force of gravity couldn't have changed. But so his theory doesn't explain the change in the force of gravity; it only explains the change in the actual diameter. So I'm not sure that I go along with that theory. But that's one way of explaining it. So contrary to the Hollow Earth study, which I said, I haven't spent much time on this, the expanding Earth evidence is much more compelling. There's a lot of scientific data out there to support it, and I personally have no doubt that the Earth has been expanding since the age of the dinosaurs. And according to James Maxwell, it's been expanding exponentially. And I think it's up to mainstream science to catch up with this and accept the findings compiled by Warren Carey, Maxwell and others, which I think proves the case beyond doubt. If you go and study that, you'll see that it's the only explanation that explains all the migration of the animals, the various places around the Earth where you see fossils in common, as James Maxwell also talks about. And perhaps our Earth is a living, growing entity. Some people surmise that it actually is a living being. And so when you look at it from that point of view, well, maybe it does grow like we grow, millions of years. And it seems to have got triggered off 180 million years ago to grow much more, according to what Maxwell has done. He's mapped all this out. And other people have said, in fact, Neal Adams covers this. I did have another video, but we ran out of time. Other planets also grow. This is not a process which is unique to the Earth. So we have to rethink the whole idea of the way that planets are formed. But the Earth is obviously the one that we can measure the best. So if you want to look at some websites, jamesmaxlow.com. I did have some booklets, but I think they're all gone. Neal Adams, NMU. If you look at nealadams.com, that's his comic website. And he's got this web page with those video clips on you can look at. The Dinosaurs and the Expanding Earth, dinox.org. That Hollow Earth websites are a very mixed bag of stuff. I couldn't recommend that. Crystal Links has quite a nice collection of links. Our Hollow Earth has a mixture of stuff on there as well, if you want to go and check that out. And that's basically it for tonight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the end. Thank you very much.